Alright, so this video is on how to get into research, or whatever I end up calling it. Hey friends, so I wanted to take a quick break from the X-ray physics videos and talk about a question that I get asked quite often, and that is how to get into a PhD.
I'm waiting for this forever.
So in this video, I thought I'd talk about my journey and how I did it, and how I think is the best way to approach it. But firstly, who am I, and why should you listen to me? Well, my name is Sahand. I currently work as a lecturer at Sydney Uni, which involves teaching, research, and unit coordination. I'm a radiographer at Loomis Imaging, which means I take X-rays and CT scans of patients. And in my spare time, which isn't a lot to be honest, I make these videos on YouTube, so hopefully they're helpful to people like yourself. And I guess it goes without saying that I have a PhD in medical imaging and radiation dose, which I received in 2023, and I did it alongside working as a radiographer. And since I only recently graduated, the process is still fresh, so I know what works. So if I made it through, you can definitely make it through. And I know that sounds like a cliche, but I'm not the smartest person in the world. I'm just a person that's very curious.
Very curious.
Alright, so that's me. Now let's get into why you clicked on the video. And I'm going to make this very clear and simple because it can get complicated depending on your situation. Now remember, everything I say in this video is about my experience and how I navigated through the process. So I guess take it with a pinch of salt. Just to give you some context, I first started inquiring about a PhD after the first semester of my master's, which by the way, they call it a graduate entry master's, or GEM for short, which is a 2-year coursework degree that you can do as a postgrad. And I did medical science before that. Anyway, so I remember reaching out to one of my professors after my first semester in year 1, and at the time I remember him saying that although he's happy to see me and he may actually have something, the best time to actually start discussing it was when there's about a semester left until I finish the course. So for me that basically meant waiting a year, so I'd be in my second and final year after semester 1. And that's when the first lesson comes in, and that is to inquire early, to plant the seed and then follow up. This just helps you to have that initial discussion to see what opportunities there are, and if there's nothing at that time, then that gives your potential supervisor to see what they can come up with until then. And what does this discussion look like? Well, it's very introductory, so you introduce yourself formally, you say your intentions, and you ask questions about how the whole process works. And by the way, learn how to talk to people, or in this case, how to email people in a very polite manner and in a way that's very giving, in order to get the response that you're looking for. Trust me, it goes a long way. So you can start off by saying something like this. Dear Professor X, hope you're doing well. First of all, I just wanted to say I've really been enjoying your lectures on X-ray physics. The concepts are difficult, but you explain things really clearly, and I'm finding it very interesting. I'm interested in doing a PhD, so I was wondering if I could meet with you at your convenience to discuss that and some other general questions I have about research. Really appreciate it. Many thanks. Regards, Sahand. Something like that, right? Don't copy it word for word, because first, that's lazy, and second, it sounds better when it's actually coming from you, even if it's not perfect, which that definitely wasn't. So once you set up this introductory meeting, you want to get to know them, ask them questions, and clarify things that you're confused about. Like for me, I remember asking, what even is a thesis? Is that the same thing as a dissertation? What happens after you get a PhD? How much money can you expect to make? And what are the other pathway options after you get a PhD? Well, at least those were the questions that I was interested in and wanted to know. Yours may differ. The point is, write them all down, ask your questions, so at least you have a base understanding of what you're getting yourself into. Alright, so let's say now some time has passed and there's a few months left until you graduate. What do? Also, what I'm about to say also applies if you're not currently studying but want to do a PhD as well. Now, generally, there's 2 ways of going about this. The first way is that you have a question and you know what you want your research to be about. Alright, great. That's almost like all the hard work is done, right? You know how in science we say the most important thing is the question, and that's true. But in this case, I think it's a little bit different, or at least my experience was. But if you have your research question, which could be, I don't know, something like, what is the cumulative effect of radiation dose from mammography on a population of women across a lifetime of screening? Or whatever your question is, then your next step is to find a supervisor with that expertise and experience with that kind of research. And that even if you find that person, that they have the time and workload to take you on as a student. And that's not even mentioning any funding or scholarship opportunities you may want to look into, because it is a new question you've come up with, right? And there are of course cases where people do this, where they're proactive enough to do the literature search and review to see if the question is even warranted and can be addressed, aka the gap in the literature. But if you're anything like I was, a student that doesn't really know what's going on and just knows they want to do a PhD, that's a lot to take on. So what's the alternative approach? Excellent question. And that's when my second lesson comes in, which is to take the path of least resistance. So the other way, which is how I personally got started, is to reach out to your lecturers and researchers that you know of, ask them some questions and see whether they can take you on as a student. The first thing I did was to write down a list of names. And for me, it was a list of all my lecturers. And that was pretty easy, well, because they were my lecturers. And then I also added anyone that was in our discipline that maybe didn't really teach us, but I knew that they had a strong research background, or rather they were heavily involved in research. So that was step one, basically writing down a list of people to contact. The second step was to construct my email. Now, anytime I write an email, I make sure it's very polite and sincere, and that it's not just copy paste it from GPT. Because believe me, you can tell. I also try to add a personal touch, which meant doing some research about that person or what they were recently up to. So that meant just looking at their university or ResearchGate profile, and even things like LinkedIn or Twitter, now X, if they had one, or even their name on Google Scholar. You know, anything to bring up the latest work so that I could just learn a little bit more about them and have that be part of our conversation. And giving reference to that in the email, because those are the type of emails that get responses if they get a response at all. That tip right there is so valuable that if that's all you take from this video, then I'm happy. And that's pretty much it. That's when I started writing the emails, kept it very brief. I introduced myself, you know, because there's about 80 to 100 students in the cohort, and maybe they just didn't remember me by my name, what my intention was, and whether they could meet me. So your email could look something like this. Dear Professor X, hope you're doing well. My name is Sahand and I'm a second year master's student. I wanted to kindly follow up from our discussion from last year on research and doing a PhD. I've been really enjoying the course so far and the concepts you teach in your class. And I love how you bring your findings from your own research in the lectures. I hope one day to contribute to the field in this way. If possible, could I please meet with you in the coming weeks at your convenience to discuss further? Regards, Sahand. So what I've done here is I've given a brief intro to who I am in case they forgot me. Also, pro tip, if you can include a link to your LinkedIn page or anywhere that they can see your face, that really helps. I know it does for me when a student reaches out to me, so you could put it in the signature at the end of your email or anywhere you prefer. Anyway, so I introduced myself and I reminded them of what the conversation was about, giving them a compliment of what I've observed about them and how they've inspired me, and then ending with a request for a meeting. Notice I haven't asked exactly what I'm going to ask them, but you could do this. It actually helps them to prepare to answer your questions a lot better if they have an idea of what you're going to ask them. So at the end of your email, you can say, hey, this is a list of stuff that I want to talk about, and here are the list of questions for your reference. Obviously try to word it better than that, but you get the idea. Just again, always try to make the email about them and not yourself, right? It's about giving them value in this process as well. I know this is a little hard to do, so I might do a separate video on it. Let me know if you're interested. But again, you want to, as much as you can, make it frictionless on their end and make it beneficial for both parties. Now, when you do eventually set up the meeting and show up on the day, here's a list of questions you can ask. What are some of the research you're currently involved with? What kind of research projects have you done in the past? And if you're interested and satisfied with their responses to those first two questions, then that's when you ask this next one. Do you possibly have any current active projects, or at least one yet to start, that would need a full-time PhD student? And if so, could I come on board and for you to be my supervisor? And look, the reason for that last question is because you may have found your match, as in you're interested in what their research is and you're keen to work with them, but do they even have the workload capacity to take you on? That's probably not what the average student is thinking about, but it's something to note, because at least for me, it was a point of friction. So what happened with me was that I'd met with a bunch of my lecturers, a bunch of them actually, I think 8 meetings in total. And I finally thought I'd found the supervisor because his previous and current research was really interesting to me and I wanted him to be my supervisor. But the problem was that he was very overloaded. As in, the usual rule is that you can have up to 5 HDR students, higher degree research students, and this supervisor had 8 at the time, so it definitely felt out of reach. Anyway, after that meeting, I kind of went home a bit disappointed, but I knew, you know what, it's okay, I'm going to find someone else. And here's where the third lesson comes in, and that is to always stay curious and be opportunistic. Because throughout the next few weeks, as I was doing my thing, studying for finals that were coming up, as you do, one of my other lecturers in conversation told me that they're going to a radiology conference in Canberra to do a pilot study for a few days. And if I was interested to join them, not to be part of the study, but to see at least what goes on behind the scenes. And at this stage, I didn't even know what a pilot study was. But I was curious and I looked into it and I found out that it just means it's early research data collection. And they do this to come up with some starter data which forms the basis of what they're actually going to be researching later. And keep in mind, this was right before my exam, so the average student isn't thinking, I'm just going to go to a conference to see what happens. But I thought, you know what, I'll go. I'll seize the opportunity that's been presented towards me, and at least it'll show me if it's something I'll be really interested in, right? So the day came and we drove down to Canberra, and by we, I mean me and my dad, because he was nice enough to come with me down there so I didn't have to worry about parking the car in a new city. And I decided to go one of the days, a Sunday, you know, because I couldn't afford accommodation for all of the days, and I thought one day would be enough. But I didn't realize that going on the last day of a conference, where it's practically dead, is not the best idea. But you know, you live and you learn. Now, although this sounds a little depressing, this was actually going to be a major turning point in my life. So what happened is that I arrived pretty early and I came in to see the setup at around 9 AM. And the idea was that they were going to get radiologists to do some test sets and to later analyze that data as part of the pilot study. Anyways, long story short, barely got any radiologists to participate, you know, because probably the last day of the conference. And at one stage, I remember looking at the time and it was about 3 PM and we'd only had 4 or 5 participants. Well, usually they would expect about 20. So a bit of a disappointing day. Until about an hour later, where I started to see some familiar faces, which was quite surprising. And guess who it was? Well, you're not going to guess, so I'll just tell you. It was the same professor who I'd hoped would be my supervisor. He'd come to visit with one of his colleagues to, you know, visit this conference and go to some seminars. He recognized me, we started talking, asking each other how things were, etc. And at the end, they both told me that they recently started a project on radiation dose and screening mammography that needs a full-time PhD student on it. And I'm thinking, what? Are you serious? Like what's the catch here? Because this is exactly what I was looking for and would not have been offered this project with this particular supervisory team if I hadn't come to that conference. So it was really cool for me because it was a lot of luck and being at the right place at the right time. But I think most importantly, I was curious enough to pursue the opportunities that were presented to me. And the rest is history. We eventually did end up working together on my project. And that's my little story of how I got into a PhD. Now, once you're in, there's a whole bunch of other challenges that you'll face, and knowing how to best navigate those will help you greatly. So if anyone's interested in that, I might make a part 2 to this video. Let me know down in the comments section your specific questions and see where that takes us. Now, I'm sure this didn't address every possible scenario, but I hope it was helpful. And I hope now you have a good general idea of how to approach getting into a PhD. Again, if you have any questions, pop them in the comment section down below. I'll try to address them to the best of my ability. Anyways, that's it for now. See you in the next one. Stay curious.